Aristotle's Poetics, a translation by S. H. Butcher. 1. I propose to treat of poetry in itself and of its various kinds, noting the essential quality of each, to inquire into the structure of the plot as requisite to a good poem, into the number and nature of the parts of which a poem is composed, and similarly into whatever else falls within the same inquiry. Following then the order of nature, let us begin with the principles which come first. Epic poetry and tragedy, comedy also, and dithyrambic poetry, and the music of the flute and of the lyre, in the most of their forms, are all in their general conception modes of imitation. They differ, however, from one another in three respects: the medium, the objects, the manner or mode of imitation being in each case distinct. For as there are persons who, by conscious art or mere habit, imitate and represent various objects through the medium of colour and form, or again by the voice, so in the arts above mentioned, taken as a whole, the imitation is produced by rhythm, language, or harmony, either singly or combined. Thus, in the music of the flute and of the lyre, harmony and rhythm alone are employed. Also in other arts, such as that of shepherd's pipe, which are essentially similar to these. In dancing, rhythm alone is used without harmony, for even dancing imitates character, emotion, and action by rhythmical movement. There is another art which imitates by means of language alone, and that either in prose or verse, which verse again may either combine different meters or consist of but one kind, but this has hitherto been without a name. For there is no common term we could apply to the mimes of Sophron and Xenocerus, and the Socratic dialogues on the one hand, and on the other to poetic imitations in iambic, elegiac, or any similar meter. People do indeed add the word maker or poet to the name of the meter, and speak of elegiac poets or epic, that is, hexameter poets, as if it were not the imitation that makes the poet, but the verse that entitles them all indiscriminately to the name. Even when a treatise on medicine or natural science is brought out in verse, the name of poet is by custom given to the author, and yet Homer and Empedocles have nothing in common but the meter, so that it would be right to call the one poet, the other physicist, rather than poet. On the same principle, even if a writer in his poetic imitation were to combine all meters, as Coureman did in his Centaur, which is a medley composed of meters of all kinds, we should bring him too under the general term poet. So much then for these distinctions. There are again some arts which employ all the means above mentioned, namely rhythm, tune, and meter. Such are dithyrambic and gnomic poetry, and also tragedy and comedy. But between them the difference is that in the first two cases these means are all employed in combination. In the latter, now one means is employed, now another. Such then are the differences of the arts with respect to the medium of imitation. 2. Since the objects of imitation are men in action, and these men must be either of a higher or a lower type, for moral character mainly answers to these divisions, goodness and badness being the distinguishing marks of moral differences. It follows that we must represent men either as better than in real life, or as worse, or as they are. It is the same in painting. Polygnotus depicted men as nobler than they are, Paulson as less noble. Dionysus drew them true to life. Now it is evident that each of the modes of imitation above mentioned will exhibit these differences and become a distinct kind in imitating objects that are thus distinct. Such diversities may be found even in dancing, flute playing, and lyre playing. So again in language, whether prose or verse, unaccompanied by music. Homer, for example, makes men better than they are, Cleophon as they are. Hegemon, the Thesian, the inventor of parodies, and Nicocarus, the author of Dialoid, worse than they are. The same thing holds good of dithyrambics and gnomes. Here too one may portray different types, as Timotheus and Philoxenus differed in representing their Cyclops. The same distinction marks of tragedy from comedy. For comedy aims at representing men as worse, tragedy as better than in actual life. 3. There's still a third difference, the manner in which each of these objects may be imitated. For the medium being the same and the objects the same, the poet may imitate by narration, in which case he can either take another personality, as Homer does, or speak in his own person, unchanged, or he may present all his characters as living and moving before us. These, then, as we said at the beginning, are the three differences which distinguish artistic imitation: the medium, the objects, and the manner. So that from one point of view, Sophocles is an imitator of the same kind as Homer, for both imitate higher types of character. From another point of view, of the same kind as Aristophanes, for both imitate persons acting and doing. Hence, some say, the name of drama is given to such poems as representing action. For the same reasons, the Dorians claimed the invention both of tragedy and comedy. The claim to comedy is put forward by the Megarians, not only by those of Greece proper, who alleged that it originated under their democracy, but also by the Megarians of Sicily, for the poet Epicharmus, who is much earlier than Chionides and Magnus, belonged to that country. Tragedy, too, is claimed by certain Dorians of the Peloponnese. In each case, they appeal to the evidence of language. The outlying villages, they say, are by them called Comai, by the Athenians Demoi, and they assume that comedians were so named not from Comazane, to revel, but because they wandered from village to village, katakomos, being excluded contemptuously from the city. They add also that the Dorian word for doing is duran, and the Athenian pratein. This may suffice as to the number and the nature of the various modes of imitation. 4. Poetry in general seems to have sprung from two causes, each of them lying deep in our nature. First, the instinct of imitation is implanted in man from childhood. One difference between him and other animals being that he is the most imitative of living creatures, and through imitation learns his earliest lessons. And no less universal is the pleasure felt in things imitated. We have evidence of this in the facts of experience. Objects which in themselves we view with pain we delight to contemplate when reproduced with minute fidelity, such as the forms of the most ignoble animals and of dead bodies. The cause of this, again, is that to learn gives the liveliest pleasure not only to philosophers but to men in general, whose capacity, however, of learning is more limited. Thus, the reason why men enjoy seeing a likeness is that in contemplating it, they find themselves learning or inferring, and saying perhaps, "Ah, that is he." For if you happen not to have seen the original, the pleasure will be due not to the imitation as such, but to the execution, the colouring, or some such other cause. Imitation, then, is one instinct of our nature. Next, there is the instinct for harmony and rhythm, meters being manifestly sections of rhythm. Persons, therefore, starting with this natural gift, developed by degrees their special aptitudes, till their rude improvisations gave birth to poetry. Poetry now diverged in two directions according to the individual character of the writers. The graver spirits imitated noble actions and the actions of good men. The more trivial sort imitated the actions of meaner persons, at first composing satires, as the former did hymns to the gods and the praises of famous men. A poem of the satirical kind cannot indeed be put down to any author earlier than Homer, though many such writers probably there were. But from Homer onward, instances can be cited. His own Margites, for example, and other similar compositions. The appropriate meter was also here introduced. Hence, the measure is still called the iambic or lampooning measure, being that in which people lampooned one another. Thus, the older poets were distinguished as writers of heroic or of lampooning verse. As, in the serious style, Homer is preeminent among poets, for he alone combined dramatic form with excellence of imitation. So he too first laid down the main lines of comedy by dramatizing the ludicrous instead of writing personal satire. His Margites bears the same relation to comedy that the Iliad and Odyssey do to tragedy. But when tragedy and comedy came to light, the two classes of poets still followed their natural bent. The lampooners became writers of comedy, and the epic poets were succeeded by tragedians, since the drama was a larger and higher form of art. Whether tragedy has as yet perfected its proper types or not, and whether it is to be judged in itself or in relation also to the audience, this raises another question. Be that as it may, tragedy, as also comedy, was at first mere improvisation. The one originated with the authors of the Dithram, the other with those of the phallic songs, which are still in use in many of our cities. Tragedy advanced by slow degrees. Each new element that showed itself was in turn developed. Having passed through many changes, it found its natural form, and there it stopped. Aeschylus first introduced a second actor. He diminished the importance of the chorus and assigned the leading part to the dialogue. Sophocles raised the number of actors to 3 and added scene painting. Moreover, it was not till late that the short plot was discarded for one of greater compass, and the grotesque diction of the earlier satiric form for the stately manner of tragedy. The iambic measure then replaced the trochaic tetrameter. which was originally employed when the poetry was of the satiric order, and had greater affinities with dancing. Once dialogue had come in, nature himself discovered the appropriate measure. For the iambic is, of all measures, the most colloquial. We see it in the fact that conversational speech runs into iambic lines more frequently than into any other kind of verse, rarely into hexameters, and only when we drop the colloquial intonation. The additions to the number of episodes or acts and the other accessories of which tradition tells must be taken as already described, for to discuss them in detail would doubtless be a large undertaking. 5. Comedy is, as we have said, an imitation of characters of a lower type, not, however, in the full sense of the word bad, the ludicrous being merely a subdivision of the ugly. It consists in some defect or ugliness which is not painful or destructive. To take an obvious example, the comic mask is ugly and distorted, but does not imply pain. The successive changes through which tragedy passed and the authors of these changes are well known, whereas comedy has had no history because it was not at first treated seriously. It was late before Diction granted a comic chorus to a poet. The performers were till then voluntary. Comedy had already taken definite shape when comic poets, distinctively so-called, are heard of. Who furnished it with masks or prologues or increased the number of actors, these and other similar details remain unknown. As for the plot, it came originally from Sicily, but of Athenian writers, Crates was the first who, abandoning the iambic or lampooning form, generalized his themes and plots. Epic poetry agrees with tragedy insofar as it is an imitation in verse of characters of a higher type. They differ in that epic poetry admits but one kind of meter and is narrative in form. They differ again in their length, for tragedy endeavors, as far as possible, to confine itself to a single revolution of the sun, or but slightly to exceed this limit, whereas the epic action has no limits of time. This, then, is a second point of difference, though at first the same freedom was admitted in tragedy as in epic poetry. Of their constituent parts, some are common to both, some peculiar to tragedy. Whoever, therefore, knows what is good or bad tragedy knows also about epic poetry. All the elements of an epic poem are found in tragedy, but the elements of a tragedy are not all found in the epic poem. 6. Of the poetry which imitates in hexameter verse and of comedy we will speak hereafter. Let us now discuss tragedy, resuming its formal definition as resulting from what has been already said. Tragedy, then, is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action, not of narrative, through pity and fear affecting the proper purgation of these emotions. By language embellished, I mean language into which rhythm, harmony, and song enter. By the several kinds in separate parts, I mean that some parts are rendered through the medium of verse alone, others again with the aid of song. Now, as tragic imitation implies persons acting, it necessarily follows, in the first place, that spectacular equipment will be a part of tragedy. Next, song and diction, for these are the medium of imitation. By diction I mean the mere metrical arrangement of the words. As for song, it is a term whose sense everyone understands. Again, tragedy is the imitation of an action, and an action implies personal agents who necessarily possess certain distinctive qualities, both of character and thought. For it is by these that we qualify actions themselves, and these, thought and character, are the two natural causes from which actions spring, and on actions again all success or failure depends. Hence, the plot is the imitation of the action, for by plot I here mean the arrangement of the incidents. By character I mean that in virtue of which we ascribe certain qualities to the agents. Thought is required whenever a statement is proved, or it may be a general truth enunciated. Every tragedy, therefore, must have 6 parts, which parts determine its quality, namely plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, song. 2 of the parts constitute the medium of imitation, 1 the manner, and the 3 the objects of imitation, and these complete the list. These elements have been employed, we may say, by the poets to a man. In fact, every play contains spectacular elements as well as character, plot, diction, song, and thought. But most important of all is the structure of the incidents. For tragedy is an imitation not of men but of an action and of life, and life consists in action, and its end is a mode of action, not a quality. Now, character determines men's qualities, but it is by their actions that they are happy or reverse. Dramatic action, therefore, is not with a view to the representation of character. Character comes in as subsidiary to the actions. Hence, the incidents and the plot are the end of a tragedy, and the end is the chief thing of all. Again, without action there cannot be a tragedy. There may be without character. The tragedies of most of our modern poets fail in the rendering of character, and of poets in general this is often true. It is the same in painting, and here lies the difference between Zeuxis and Polygnotus. Polygnotus delineates character well. The style of Zeuxis is devoid of ethical quality. Again, if you string together a set of speeches expressive of character and well finished in point of diction and thought, you will not produce the essential tragic effect nearly so well as with a play which, however deficient in these respects, yet has a plot and artistically constructed incidents. Besides which, the most powerful elements of emotional interest in tragedy, peripeteia, or reversal of the situation, and recognition scenes are parts of the plot. A further proof is that novices in the art attain to finish of diction and precision of portraiture before they can construct a plot. It is the same with almost all the early poets. The plot, then, is the first principle, and, as it were, the soul of a tragedy. Character holds the second place. A similar fact is seen in painting. The most beautiful colors, laid on confusedly, will not give as much pleasure as the chalk outline of a portrait. Thus tragedy is the imitation of an action, and of the agents mainly with a view to the action. Third in order is thought, that is, the faculty of saying what is possible and pertinent in given circumstances. In the case of oratory, this is the function of the political art and of the art of rhetoric, and so indeed the older poets make their characters speak the language of civic life. The poets of our time, the language of the rhetoricians. Character is that which reveals moral purpose, showing what kind of things a man chooses or avoids. Speeches, therefore, which do not make this manifest, or in which the speaker does not choose or avoid anything whatever, are not expressive of character. Thought, on the other hand, is found where something is proved to be or not to be, or a general maxim is enunciated. Fourth among the elements enumerated comes diction, by which I mean, as has been already said, the expression of the meaning in words, and its essence is the same both in verse and prose. Of the remaining elements, song holds the chief place among the embellishments. The spectacle has indeed an emotional attraction of its own, but of all the parts, it is the least artistic and connected least with the art of poetry. For the power of tragedy, we may be sure, is felt even apart from representation and actors. Besides, the production of spectacular effects depends more on the art of the stage machinist than on that of the poet. 7. These principles being established, let us now discuss the proper structure of the plot, since this is the first and most important thing in tragedy. Now, according to our definition, tragedy is an imitation of an action that is complete and whole and of a certain magnitude. But there may be a whole that is wanting in magnitude. A whole is that which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A beginning is that which does not itself follow anything by casual necessity, but after which something naturally is or comes to be. An end, on the contrary, is that which itself naturally follows some other thing, either by necessity or as a rule, but has nothing following it. A middle is that which follows something as some other thing follows it. A well-constructed plot, therefore, must neither begin nor end at haphazard, but conform to these principles. Again, a beautiful object, whether it be a living organism or any whole composed of parts, must not only have an orderly arrangement of parts, but must also be of a certain magnitude, for beauty depends on magnitude and order. Hence, a very small animal organism cannot be beautiful, for the view of it is confused, the object being seen in almost imperceptible moment of time. Nor, again, can one of the vast size be beautiful, for as the eye cannot take it all in at once, the unity and sense of the whole is lost for the spectator. As for instance, if there were one 1,000 miles long. As, therefore, in the case of animate bodies and organisms, a certain magnitude is necessary, and a magnitude which may be easily embraced in one view, so in the plot a certain length is necessary, and a length which can be easily embraced by the memory. The limit of length in relation to dramatic competition and sensuous presentment is no part of artistic theory. For had it been the rule for 100 tragedies to compete together, the performance would have been regulated by the water clock, as indeed we are told was formerly done. But the limit, as fixed by the nature of the drama itself, is this: the greater the length, the more beautiful will the piece be by reason of its size, provided that the whole be perspicuous. And to define the matter roughly, we may say that the proper magnitude is comprised within such limits that the sequence of events, according to the law of probability or necessity, will admit of a change from bad fortune to good, or from good fortune to bad. 8. Unity of plot does not, as some persons think, consist in the unity of the hero, for infinitely various are the incidents in one man's life which cannot be reduced to unity, and so, too, there are many actions of one man out of which we cannot make one action. Hence, the error, as it appears, of all poets who have composed a Heraclid, a Theseid, or other poems of the kind. They imagine that as Heracles was one man, the story of Heracles must be also a unity. But Homer, as in all else he is of surpassing merit, here too, whether from art or natural genius, seems to have happily discerned the truth. In composing the Odyssey, he did not include all the adventures of Odysseus, such as his wound on Parnassus, or his feigned madness at the mastering of the host, incidents between which there was no necessary or probable connection, but he made the Odyssey, and likewise the Iliad, to center round an action that in our sense of the word is one. As, therefore, in the other imitative arts, the imitation is one when the object imitated is one, so the plot, being an imitation of an action, must imitate one action, and that a whole, the structural union of the parts being such that, if any one of them is displaced or removed, the whole will be disjointed and disturbed. For a thing whose presence or absence makes no visible difference is not an organic part of the whole. 9. It is, moreover, evident from what has been said that it is not the function of the poet to relate what has happened, but what may happen, what is possible according to the law of probability or necessity. The poet and the historian differ not by writing in verse or in prose. The work of Herodotus might be put into verse, and it would still be a species of history, with meter no less than without it. The true difference is that one relates what has happened, the other what may happen. Poetry, therefore, is a more philosophical and a higher thing than history, for poetry tends to express the universal, history the particular. By the universal, I mean how a person of a certain type will on occasion speak or act, according to the law of probability or necessity, and it is this universality at which poetry aims in the names she attaches to the personages. The particular, for example, what Alcibiades did or suffered. In comedy, this is already apparent, for here the poet first constructs the plot on the lines of probability and then inserts characteristic names, unlike the lampooners who write about particular individuals. But tragedians still keep to real names, the reason being that what is possible is credible. What has not happened we do not at once feel sure to be possible. But what has happened is manifestly possible. Otherwise it would not have happened. Still, there are even some tragedies in which there are only one or two well-known names, the rest being fictitious. In others, none are well known, as in Agathon's Antheus, where incidents and names alike are fictitious, and yet they give none the less pleasure. We must not, therefore, at all costs, keep to the received legends, which are the usual subjects of tragedy. Indeed, it would be absurd to attempt it, for even subjects that are known only to a few, and yet give pleasure to all. It clearly follows that the poet or maker should be the maker of plots rather than of verses, since he is a poet because he imitates, and what he imitates are actions. And even if he chances to take an historical subject, he is nonetheless a poet, for there is no reason why some events that have actually happened should not conform to the law of the probable and possible, and in virtue of that quality in them he is their poet or maker. Of all plots and actions, the episodic are the worst. I call a plot episodic in which the episodes or acts succeed one another without probable or necessary sequence. Bad poets compose such pieces by their own fault, good poets to please the players. For as they write show pieces for competition, they stretch the plot beyond its capacity and often forced to break the natural continuity. But again, tragedy is an imitation not only of a complete action, but of events inspiring fear or pity. Such an effect is best produced when the events come on us by sunrise, and the effect is heightened when at the same time they follow as cause and effect. The tragic wonder will be greater than if they happen of themselves or by accident. For even coincidences are most striking when they have an air of design. We may instance the statue of Metis at Argos, which fell upon his murderer while he was a spectator at a festival and killed him. Such events seem not to be due to mere chance. Plots, therefore, constructed on these principles are necessarily the best. 10. Plots are either simple or complex, or the actions in real life of which the plots are an imitation obviously show a similar distinction. An action which is one and continuous in the sense above defined I call simple, when the change of fortune takes place without reversal of the situation and without recognition. A complex action is one in which the change is accompanied by such reversal or by recognition or by both. These last should arise from the internal structure of the plot, so that what follows should be the necessary or probable result of the preceding action. It makes all the difference whether any given event is a case of propter hoc or post hoc.